Hi, this is James Cook of the University of Maine at Augusta, and I'm recording this video for the social science program to talk about gender as a social structure, a structure of stratification. Let's start this conversation off by thinking about the word sexism. It's a word that's been used quite a lot inside and outside of sociology, but there are reasons to avoid that word when we're trying to figure out the questions what kind of, how, and why. So to think about this, let's compare two different Introduction to Sociology textbooks' approach to thinking about the word sexism. Dalton Conley, in his textbook, You May Ask Yourself, defines sexism and gives it a prominent placement in his chapter on gender as, quote, when a person's sex or gender is the basis of judgment, discrimination, and hatred against him or her. So let's think about that definition of sexism and what it implies. First of all, it's described as sexism, which is, according to Dalton Conley, judgment, discrimination, or hatred on the basis of sex or gender. As we've already discussed in other videos and lecture materials, sex and gender are really two very distinct things. There are these ideas, these concepts that are related because of cultural links, but not necessarily otherwise. So to connect the two, first of all, is to reinforce the necessary connection between sex and gender, which is not always necessary. Second of all, it thinks about sex as elevated as a term above gender through the use of the word sexism, when actually sex is not something that is directly visible to other people in most interactions, where sex is defined, as we have before, as some combination of genetics, primary sex characteristics, and secondary sex characteristics. Some indirect display of secondary sex characteristics may be the closest we get in everyday interaction. What we see instead are people's gender, which is a set of beliefs, values, practices, uses of material objects to signify something about a person. So gender is a better term. Furthermore, if we think about that definition, when a person's sex or gender is the basis for judgment, discrimination, and hatred against him or her, well, we have two pronouns, him and her, which it has been quickly supplanted with they by a number of people. But let's focus in on judgment, discrimination, and hatred. Those are three very different things. Judgment is a conception, hatred is an emotion, and discrimination is an action. So one of the problems with using a word like sexism is that it becomes very difficult when we are trying to get as specific as possible to know exactly what we're talking about when we're talking about it. For that reason, in another textbook, Essentials of Sociology by Anthony Giddens and co-authors, sexism does not receive a definition at all, and instead terms such as inequality, prejudice, and discrimination are used to describe a system of gender stratification, where inequality refers to the existence of strata that are different from one another, where prejudice refers to ideas, whether it's emotional ideas of hatred or thoughts of judgment against categories of individuals, and then discrimination is action. And because we can use different words, gender inequality, gender prejudice, and gender discrimination to talk about these different practices, we can speak with a little bit more precision, as a matter of fact, a lot more precision when we're thinking about gender as a system. and how it works. So this distinction between prejudice and discrimination, ideas and actions, stems from the work of Robert K. Merton, a seminal sociologist of the 20th century, who wrote a piece called Discrimination and the American Creed, in which he talked about the idea of there being a culture or practice of an institution or of a community or of a nation that exerts pressures on the individual, pressures that the individual may accede to or may resist. He wrote, conduct may or may not conform with individuals' own beliefs. Attitudes and overt behavior can vary independently. How an individual acts is not always the same as how an individual thinks. We tend to bring those two together in our American culture, in our American creed, that everything stems from individual actions. So, that if someone discriminates, they must be prejudiced, and that if someone expresses prejudice, they must discriminate as a result. We also think that somebody who is not a discriminator must also not be prejudiced, or someone who is not prejudiced will therefore not discriminate. That's two of the four boxes in this 2x2 table that you see here, but there are two other possibilities: that someone may not be prejudiced and yet they may discriminate, or that someone may be prejudiced but not discriminate. How can that happen? It can happen when the individual mindset, whatever that is, and however you might observe that, varies from the institutional setting in which a person finds themselves. So, for instance, if someone is not prejudiced, they have no problem, for instance, with hiring women or men for the same position within their organization, but they have a boss who has told them, I'm sorry, we don't want any women hired for this position. They may, even though they do not agree in their heart, in their mind, they do not have prejudice, in order to keep their job, they may discriminate. On the other hand, you may have someone who is quite bigoted against women in a certain setting, doesn't believe that women can be good engineers, and yet they know that in the job they have, there are regulations, and that if they get found discriminating against an equally qualified woman, that they will get fired, or that they will be brought up before a review board, that they will have violated some regulation, some law, some policy. And so they will not discriminate, even though they may hold prejudice inside their heart. The two dimensions do not have to belong together. And the fact that they often don't is an indication, yet again, of the difference between individuals and social structures. Social structures can alter what individuals do. When we think about gender, and we think about it not just as a set of cultural categories, but we think of it as a set of levels where there are these gender positions. Some who get the most resources, the most power, the most prestige, the best treatment. Some others who end up in a middle position, and some who end up on the bottom with the least resources, the least power, the least prestige, the worst treatment in a situation. That is a social structure. As long as it is a description of how people in different positions, gendered positions, fare, they fare differently, systematically according to those positions. That is a set of descriptions of the relationship between positions. Who gets more, who gets less, in any interaction in which power, prestige, resources can flow to or flow away from a person in a position as a result. A social structure is a pattern of interactions between positions, between people in positions according to those positions. And so this pattern is a social structure, and it's worth pointing that out here. To find differences in these positions, we can study discrimination through something called a field experiment or an audit study. And to think about that, we can actually travel to a field.
When I was a kid in school and I heard we were going to have a field trip, I sometimes wondered to myself, why don't we ever actually end up in a field? Why do they call it a field trip if we aren't going to a field? You know, a field like a place with grass and the blue sky overhead, birds, maybe the occasional deer, a possum, bobolink, porcupine, farmer in the distance, that sort of thing. Well, I learned later on that there are really two senses to the word field. One sense of the word field is grass, sky, something, place you could plow if you wanted to. But the other is to think about a place outside of the place where you usually think about things in the abstract. It's the place where things happen, where the things that you study actually take place. And so in that sense, a field trip is a place to go where things actually happen that you may have been studying in school. Similarly, as social scientists, we occasionally carry out field experiments. And a field experiment is an experiment that doesn't happen in our place, where we think about things and we invite someone else in. A field experiment happens when we go to the place where things happen and we carry out the experiment there, in the situation where the outcome we're interested in happens every day. And so in the sociology of discrimination, we can think about field experiments. And we're not talking about this kind of field. We're talking about the kind of field where discrimination may or may not happen every day. These field experiments are tests to see whether the kinds of discrimination we imagine back at school actually happens. How do we figure that out? Well, the idea of a field experiment is to go into a situation as it is, not as you imagine it, and to set things up with, at its simplest, a pair of people. Two people. Two people alike in almost every possible respect. They may dress alike. They may look alike. They may act alike. They may be told to do the same things. They may be assigned fictional attributes. These fictional attributes involve, education, income, what have I forgotten? Well, there's also neighborhood. The very fact of neighborhood can influence the way that people are thought of, the way people are treated. And so you have to set all those to be exactly the same. Exactly the same except for one thing. And that one thing is either leading to no difference in how people are treated or a whole lot of difference in how people are treated. And if we see a difference in treatment between two people and they're otherwise the same, then what do we have? We have discrimination, which is treating people differently on the basis of some one thing.
One classic audit study involves bargaining for a new car. This is one of the most stressful activities that individuals can engage in because we know that there's some kind of bargaining that has to go on and that not everybody going in to get a price for a car is going to get the same result. So Ian Ayers and Peter Siegelman back in 1995 said, we'd like to study why it is that some people get a better result and other people get a worse result. And what they did was build an audit study in which they had testers, in which those testers going into the dealership were trained to have the same approach to bargaining. That is, that they would offer a certain amount above the manufacturer's suggested retail price. They would then come back for a second round of negotiating by following a strict algorithm in which they move a certain direction, a certain amount. Everybody does the same thing. All of the testers do the same. They have the same clothing, indicating the same level of class, like a collared shirt but without a tie if you're a man, okay? And similar indications of class, the same age, same education levels, the same occupational prestige levels. These have been measured in surveys. The same area of residence, which is key because when you give your address, it is a signal to a canny negotiator about your background, where you come from, what your cultural background may be, what your assumptions are, what your capabilities might be, whether that is fair or not. So the same area of residence, the same neighborhood in a city is chosen, the same financing ability, so the same credit score. What's different if all that is the same? Gender and race. Men and women are sent in as pairs. Black people and white people are sent in as pairs. And the combination of black, white, as the indications of race in this study, man and woman as the binary indicators of gender in this study, create 4 possibilities. So you have 4 individuals who have the same characteristics that go in, do the same things, but they only have race and gender that differ. So then there's an outcome, actually 2 outcomes. The first is when a first offer is made, say, I'd like to buy it for this. What is the initial profit to the dealer when the dealer comes back, right? So, and then finally, after the second round of negotiation, what is the final price that is offered by the dealer to the tester who is coming in saying, I'd like to buy a car? Well, what's the initial offer? What's the final offer? And we can chart those results following the work of Ayers and Siegelman. And here they are. So if we go from the left to the right, we move from white male to white female to black male to black female. Black female on the right, white male on the left. Both in initial profit and final profit, the ordering is preserved. Everybody gets a slightly better deal in the final profit, but the ordering is the same in both offers. And what we can see here, okay, is first of all that the white males get the best offer, that the white females get the second best offer, that the black females get the third best offer, which is the lowest price, right? The profit that goes to the dealer based off the difference between that and what the cost is to the dealership. And finally, the best option for the dealer and the worst option for the person buying the car goes to black males. Notice here that the effect of gender is different according to race. So within the white category, it's slightly better to be a man than it is to be a woman. Notice that within the black category, on the other hand, it is better to be a woman than it is to be a man. So the effect of gender discrimination goes in different directions. However, for race, when we think about race as a basis of discrimination, it's always better, no matter what your gender is, to be white than it is to be black. So they were able to uncover both race discrimination and gender discrimination in a complicated relationship using one test, which is pretty smart. David Neumark follows up a year later in a publication in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, in which he looks at sex discrimination in restaurant hiring, and so sends people in to go apply for waiter or waitress jobs. So the interesting thing he does is, while not looking at race, looking at just gender, men and women, sends men and women in with comparable skills and experience. It sends them into different kinds of establishments. There can be low price restaurants like a Dunkin' Donuts or a McDonald's or Burger King. There are medium price restaurants like, an Applebee's or an Olive Garden. And then there's your high price restaurants, which are typically not chains at all, but are independent enterprises. These are the places with white tablecloths that cost a lot of money to go eat at. And finds that there is discrimination happening at each level, but the nature of the discrimination is different. That at the high-priced restaurants, where earnings are higher because waiters and waitresses make a lot of money from tips, applications from women led to job offers 40% less often than applications from men, even though the men and women in these pairs going out and applying together have on their application comparable skills and experience, right? They're both equally qualified for the job. Women get job offers 40% less often than men. At medium-priced restaurants, there's also discrimination, but similarly qualified women get job offers 21% less often than men. And interestingly, at low-price restaurants, applications from women led to job offers 28% more often than applications from men. So if you're applying for a low-wage job in the restaurant industry, then you get selected in, you're more likely to get the job if you're a woman. If you are going for the high-paying job, the one where you actually take home a lot of money in tips, it's men who are favored. Men who are discriminated in favor of, women who are discriminated against. What does this lead to if you have women and men who are entering these positions looking for a job as a waiter or waitress? Where do men end up? At the higher or middle level. Where do women end up? Disproportionately, they'll end up at the lowest paid jobs. That ends up putting people in positions that pay differently. Shelley Carell, Stephen Bernard, and Ian Pike in 2007, moving forward into the 21st century from the last decade of the 20th, want to know if there's something very special about parenthood when it comes to gender. And so what they do is really clever. It's a two-stage experiment, right? The first experiment is experimenting on undergraduates, not on employers themselves. And they're handed packets. So that these packets are applications that the students read through as being part of the class. There are 192 undergraduates who do that. 84 of them are men, 104 of them are women. And there are, within this big stack of applications, equally qualified applicants in there. They're matched in there, they're all shuffled up. But they have differing parental status. And that parental status can be cued by a person saying something like, I go to this church on Sundays and volunteer with them with my kids. Or they can say, I volunteer for the PTA at my kids' school. Or there can be no mention of being a parent, right? So is parental status mentioned or is parental status not mentioned? Also, there are names, and the names are gendered. So there's no Pat or Chris, right? That is an uncertain gender for the name. Instead, the names are highly gendered, like Emily or Michael. So undergraduates are asked, without knowing what the purpose is, to determine these applicants on paper, their competence, their seeming commitment to the job, what salary they should get, whether they're suitable for management, whether they should be hired, and whether they are likely to be promoted in the job. Those are all outcomes. And within these equally set pairs of equally qualified applications, set very carefully, which you can do with a paper application. The only thing that is varying are two sets of things. is the applicant a man? Is the applicant a woman? And is the applicant indicating that they are a parent, or are they not indicating that they are a parent? So here are the results with the undergraduates. And again, this is just the first wave. The mothers are judged to be less competent and less committed than women who do not indicate that they're mothers, even though they're equally qualified on paper. They're granted a lower salary by these undergraduates, less often recommended for management or promotion, or simply to be hired. And fathers, on the other hand, when they indicate that they are parents, are judged to be more competent, more committed, to be recommended for a higher salary, for management, for promotion, and to be hired more often than men who are not fathers. So what parenthood means, in other words, to these undergraduates as a signal varies according to whether it is a father or a mother. A fatherhood is very different than a motherhood. The meaning of parenthood is changed fundamentally by the gender of the applicant. And gender is taken to be something that matters in combination with parenthood, regardless of the other indicators of qualification for the job. So the brilliant move that these researchers engaged in after that was to say, well, maybe it's just undergraduates that have this problem. Maybe they're young and they haven't learned yet to treat people equally if they're equally qualified on paper. Maybe they don't know that discrimination by parental status is against the law in hiring. And they would learn that if they were on the job. So what they do then is they take those same application packets, the resumes and cover letters, from pairs of equally qualified applicants out to employers. And what varies here? Gender and parental status are the only two things that vary. And what do they find in terms of these real-world applications for, well, fake applications for real-world jobs? They find that there's this stratification structure. Remember, a stratification social structure involves different positions getting different treatment, different rewards or punishments according to their position, according to what they are in terms of their gender and parental status here. Not in terms of their quality as an applicant, because the quality of applications is the same. It's set to the same here. It turns out here that the best option for you to be is to be a female non-parent. For women who are not parents, they get the best callback rate, which is essentially somebody calling the number on the application and saying, oh, hello, we're interested in coming in and you having an interview with us. Let's have a discussion about moving forward. That's the outcome that is being measured. Let's look overall, and you'll see that the callback rate is relatively low for everybody. So if you don't get a callback from your desired job, you keep on going and keep on applying for other jobs. But you're most likely to get it if you are a woman who is not a parent. On the other hand, the callback rate goes down almost by half if you are a woman who is a parent. That's these two light orange bars, almost yellowish. So the direction is the opposite, again, just as it was for the undergraduates. If you are a male, you have a male name here, and indicate man as this gender effect. If you are not a parent, well, you're a man, you're not a dad, and you're applying, your callback rate is really quite dismal. But it improves upon parenthood. As opposed to women, it goes the other way. Now, this is really interesting because it shows that there is not a simple gender effect in which men are on top and women are on the bottom. Instead, it's combinations of gender and parenthood. And we can ask ourselves, where do people spend the most of their lives? Typically, most people become parents, and typically they do so early in their careers. So in the very early career where someone's getting started and they may not be parents yet, there is an advantage in that category of not a parent for women over men. But if we look at the parent category where most workers spend most of their lives, it reverses and there is a preference for men over women. So I encourage you to think about, for these four categories, right? Single woman, single man, father, mother. What are the assumptions about the strengths that each of those gender categories, those four genders we might say, right? Categories with expectations associated with them. What are the expectations? What are the expectations for a single woman? How's she going to do at the job? What's the expectation for a single man at a job, a bachelor? What's he going to bring to the job? What's he not going to bring to the job? What are his burdens? What are the burdens of a mother? What are the benefits of motherhood for working? What are the burdens and benefits of fatherhood? We'll find that in popular culture and in the description of working young women, young men, mothers and fathers, that the benefits and burdens that are ascribed to their positions often differ. And this research shows that even if two individuals are similarly qualified, they have the same qualifications on paper, simply saying your gender and your parental status will result in different levels of treatment, and that is discrimination. So in all these results, I'd like you to notice a general trend of intersectionality. Intersectionality is the tendency for combinations of identities along different sorts of categories, such as race, such as gender, such as class, combinations of those to matter in ways that affect people's experience in ways that are not a simple addition of those categories. To back up and say that another way, for me to be a white man, a combination of race and gender, is not simply the addition of the effect of my whiteness and the effect of the addition of my maleness or manhood, to speak in gendered terms. Instead, it's some combination of whiteness and manness that works together to create the experience that I have. Similarly, a white woman would not be a combination of just whiteness and womanness. A black woman would not just be a combination of blackness and womanness. A Latina woman would not be just a combination of this Latinx category plus adding on the label of woman. The idea is that gender may work differently according to the race you might be in. That gender might work differently according to the class you're in. And the implication of that is that we actually have, even if we just have 3 dimensions, as if there were only 3 dimensions of stratification of race, class, and gender, that we would have more than actually 3 sets of categories, that we would really have as many unique categories, potentially, as there are combinations of those 3 dimensions. Social life gets very complicated when you think about intersectionality, but that complication may be accurate. So let's go back and take a look at some examples of intersectionality in the results of audit studies that we've already examined. So going back, what we notice in these kind of results is that you can't simply say what it is to be a man or a woman. You can't simply say that all women have this experience and all men have that experience. And you can't furthermore say that there is a simple effect of parenthood, that parenthood either benefits one or injures one at work. It works different ways according to your gender. You can't simply add up gender and parenthood and get this result. In order to get this result and see this result, you have to create the possibility for seeing different combinations of gender and parental status. And that's an intersection of the two, producing this new effect. It indicates that there are, if we think of gender as a category associated with our ideas of sex and what sex means, it means that there are 4 genders here, not 2. That there are 4 genders. It's not a binary. It's highly contingent on the kind of situation that you put a man or a woman in. And they become a working mom or a working dad, or they become a single young woman, or they become a bachelor. We have names for at least most of these positions, right? And they have connotations. And those connotations, those expectations, cultural expectations, the values and beliefs we ascribe to them, the expectations we have for them, that's what gender means. So I am not kidding when I say that intersectionality here leads to 4 genders. When we think about sex discrimination in restaurant hiring, it's an intersection of gender and class. So that men have an advantage in looking for a certain kind of job, and women have advantages in looking for other kind of jobs. The idea is that men, waiters, what do we think of when we think of a man who is a waiter? Do we think of someone with a cheap apron on, bringing out a Whopper with fries? Tend not to. We tend to think, in our cultural ideas, of a young man with a tie and you know the full treatment at a high-class restaurant. We don't tend to think of women as much as occupying that position. If we think of a woman who's a waitress, she's working in a greasy spoon. She's working in a low-price restaurant. She's getting less money, and she's working hard for that money, getting lower tips, if you get tips at all. There are some restaurants, especially the lower-price ones, at which you don't. So that the idea of waiting tables is not just one kind of expectation that we have, but in this case, we have 6 of them for combinations of the class of the restaurant and the gender of the individual who's doing it. Is it a waiter or a waitress? Do they belong there or do they not? That's the question here, and we find there's an intersection between gender and class. That there's not just a simple effect of women are favored or men are favored, but that women and men are favored to go in, and they're steered through accepting or rejecting applications into different positions where they end up and then strengthen our expectations of what we will find in those kinds of establishments. The same thing happens here in an intersection of race and gender, so that the effect of gender within whiteness is that it is of benefit to be a man going in to bargain for a car, whereas within blackness, it's a distinct disadvantage to be a man. So gender, and it is of benefit to be a woman, while it is generally of a disadvantage to have dark skin, to be black in the United States, to go in and bargain for a car. The meaning of gender matters differently according to race, and the expectations that we have for the treatment that someone's going to get are different, and that means that really there are 4 race gender combinations here, and you can't simply say race has this effect and gender has this effect. They combine to effect in the experience of people trying to get a car in different ways. That's what intersectionality means. So, these exceptions to the general rule point out the cultural complexity of our gendered expectations, right? Let's look at a couple of these exceptions to the rule, where the rule is that generally women are discriminated against when it comes to advantageous positions and Men get the benefit sometimes when it comes to those advantageous positions. Whereas men, if they are discriminated against, it's in situations that would direct them into low status outcomes. Let's look at an example of the exceptions to the rule. Here's discrimination in Airbnbs. This is a particular cultural domain in which it's this newfangled thing. It used to be B&B used to stand for bed and breakfast, and people used to have bed and breakfast, and it literally would be a room that a person could stay in back before they became low-rent hotels or high-rent hotels, depending on the market. But now it's gone onto the internet, and people actually maintain entire homes for the purpose of either seasonally or all the time renting them out to short-term renters. And so there's this online market. And very recently, in a publication in the American Economic Journal of Applied Economics in 2017, Benjamin Edelman, Michael Luca, and Dan Svirsky go out and engage in another field experiment in which they're looking at racial discrimination. And they end up at the same time looking at gender discrimination in combination. So what they do is that they use the almost standard now practice of putting in fake applications electronically, thank you internet, in the 21st century, using cues for race and gender. And what they do is they take a set of names of birth certificates from 1974 to 1979, people who are in their prime of life now in the 21st century, and then gives out a survey to a bunch of people to test which of these names from Massachusetts 1974 to 79 seem very white or very black to you. What they do is they ask each person to say, do you guess that this person is white or black? And whiteness is coded 1, blackness is coded 0. And the average number that you get for a set of people, if it's like 0.5, well, that means that half the people guessed white and half the people guessed black. That's not going to be a very good signifier, because there's not this cultural agreement among people that it's either a white name or a black name. What you're looking for are names that either get an average that is very close to 0, where everybody, or almost everybody, is saying that's a black name, or you get a result that's very close to 1, which is an indication that almost everybody's saying that's a white name. And you'll notice that the names that are included here also have a very exclusive gender connotation. So that the white females here, the 5 names that are predicted are all above 0.9 on average, which means either 93% in the case of Meredith O'Brien, or 100% in the case of Kristen Sullivan, are agreeing, oh yeah, that's a white woman. And you have, on the other hand, Tyrone Robinson. That's an average of 0. Nobody's saying that's a white person. They're all saying, oh, that's an African-American male. That's a black male. And all the way through to Jermaine Jones, where, yeah, 3/4 of people are saying, yeah, that's a black male. So they took, for each of these categories, the 5 best names in terms of what they signify for black male, black female, white male. And then they put them on applications, electronic Airbnb applications. And they do this emailing a random set of Airbnb hosts in a bunch of cities: Baltimore, Dallas, Los Angeles, St. Louis, Washington. They do this in July 2015. So this is the modern era. And they use those names, the names that everyone in the surveys are saying, yep, that's pretty white, that's pretty black. And they're recognizing them as men and women. What's the rate of positive responses? Okay, so here we're seeing something that is not intersectional. It's an additive effect. Okay, so first of all, there's whiteness. Whether you're a woman or a man, if you're looking just at women, right, it's better to be white than black. If you're looking at men, it's better to be white than black. You have a higher percent positive response. If you're looking at the effective race, for women, it's better to be white than black. For men, it's better to be white than black, right? So there is an effective race, there's an effective gender, and the two add up. They don't intersect, they don't change. The effective gender doesn't affect how race works. The effective race doesn't affect how gender works. There's not an intersectionality here. Furthermore, although the racial stratification is just about what you would generally expect, unfortunately, which is that white people get a higher positive response rate universally than black people do. Women actually get a better, they get discriminated in favor of, regardless of whether they're white or black. Women get a better positive response rate than men do. Within this particular niche, women are favored to come into a person's home compared to men. Black people are, regardless of whether they're men or women, are kept at a greater arm's length. Much better to be white than it is to be black. But it is better to be a woman than it is to be a man. In this circumstance, in this niche, in this cultural domain, I encourage you to think about, when you think about a person coming into your home, what are the concerns you might have about a person coming into your home? A stranger coming into your home. When you're not there, what might they do? What would you be concerned about? And what are your cultural beliefs about people of certain positions, men versus women? In this cultural domain, are women considered safer? Are men considered more dangerous? That's highly possible. It's what is suggested here. Less suitable to enter your home, a man and then a woman. What is the domain of a home? It is a domestic, protected domain. Who belongs more in a home? Who belongs better outside the home? That gendered effect can, in some domains and at some times, actually be discriminatory against men and in favor of women, but is in line with preserving what we consider to be the traditional domains of women and men inside the home, outside the home. Right? And racially speaking, this is unfortunately a very simple story, which is that black people are discriminated against no matter their gender. Racial discrimination exists in the United States. That is a racial hierarchy that we see here in the current day as people are trying to get by and live their lives. But it's an exception in the sense that there is not intersectionality here. And there is an exception in terms of the direction of gender discrimination. So, moving then past the domain of these field experiments, also called audit studies, let's finish by thinking about the gender gap in pay. How much is a woman paid compared to a man? When we think about that, I have a few questions that I'd like us to focus on. First of all, how is the gender gap in pay measured? Where does it come from? Second, why does the gender gap in pay exist? And third, what does it say about the system of gender stratification and how gender stratification works? At the end, we'll consider how do the results indicating the sources of the gender gap in pay, how do they line up with our findings regarding gender discrimination and where that leads people? So let's think about that first idea. Where does the gender gap in pay get measured? And it gets measured through income reports, which get sent to the federal government. So thank you, taxes, right? And also thank you, pay reports and employment reports. The Bureau of Labor Statistics maintains these. There's a URL that you can follow here right on the screen to get this information. And what you'll notice, first of all, is that it is a median for men and women. In this case, the green line indicates women and the orange line indicates men. It occurs across time. The median means it is at any one moment in time, at any one year. So in 1979, the median value for men indicates that half the men who are measured here earn more than $400 and half earn less than $400. Okay, so it's a measure of what's typical. If you lined people up from the best paid to the worst paid, here in terms of men, it would the person in the middle, if they were ordered, would be at $400. If you lined up a bunch of women among the set studied here, you would find that if you ordered them from least paid to most paid in 1979, the person in the middle, the woman in the middle, would be paid $250. Now notice I've said among the set of people paid here, it's 16 years and older and full-time workers. Why? Because, first of all, the set of people who work at very young ages, that's gendered very strongly. And second of all, the kind of work that people engage in, whether the amount that they work, is also gendered. Women are much more likely to be part-time workers, and men are much more likely to be full-time workers. So if you just included all workers, there would be differences in pay, but it would be because they are not the same scale of worker in terms of how many hours they work. So to mandate, as happens in the calculation of the gender gap in pay, that they are all full-time workers and that they're all essentially at the adult level, not the early permitted child labor. It means it takes those gender differences out of the equation. We know this is not because the women here are working part-time, so they're getting paid for fewer hours. They're all full-time workers. And we see that there's a gap. We see that there's a gap, especially large in 1979, and we see that it's shrunk. The gap has shrunk. Why has the gap shrunk? Two reasons. Look at the green line. What happens there? It's an increase. Look at the orange line. Until about 2014, there wasn't an increase. In fact, there was a slight decline. And so the decline of men's wages in constant dollars adjusted for inflation, and the incline of women's leads to a difference in the pay gap. Literally, this is a gap. It is the space between these two lines. And then since then, the two lines seem to have worked in parallel, although not at the same level. Women who work full-time still are paid less in the year 2020 on a weekly basis than men are. And when you actually take the ratio of those two, you get a percentage. You can think of this as the percentage that men working full-time, it's the percentage that women get paid who are working full-time and are 16 years of age and older. You can also, because percent it works well with our currency system, you can also say about the sex gap in pay, the gender gap in pay, that for every dollar earned by men, this is the number of pennies that women are paid. So in 1979, for every dollar that 16 years of age or older, full-time working men were paid, for every dollar they were paid, women of the same labor category were paid just 62.4 cents. That's increased. The gap in pay is no longer as big as it was. In 2020, it's 82.1 cents for every dollar that a man earns. But the gap is still there. If there were equality, what would happen? We'd go up to the 100% line. That women who work full-time and are 16 years of age or older are paid at the same level in median terms as men. That's not the case. It has never been the case. in the United States. And as you can see here in the modern period, it has not been the case. It is getting less unequal, but it is still unequal. And the extent to which it is getting less unequal has changed. Look at what's happened. We saw strong gains over the 1970s, strong gains over the 1980s, moderate gains in the early 2000s, and since then, since about what, 2007, 2010, pick your dot, it's been basically not changing at all. So women's progress in terms of their pay for full-time labor compared to men has stalled. Why? What's leading to this? That's the second question. Well, one clue comes from education. If we look back in the 1970s, the neat thing is that you can calculate more than one gender pay gap. You can calculate the median earnings, and you can add more conditions. So let's say just among those with a high school diploma, right? So those with less than a high school diploma, we can see that's the orange and the red lines. In 1979, the orange and red dot are right around 60 cents. And it was slightly better, about 64 cents to the dollar if you're comparing women and men that have some college or an associate's degree. And then it gets even a little bit better. Oh, it's still pretty bad, but it's better if you're talking about bachelor's degree or higher. So in the 1970s and pretty much through the 1980s and a little bit into the 1990s, you would come out with a recommendation, right? Which is that if you want to have a lower gap between men and women in pay, there's something to emulate about those jobs that go to people with higher educations. But look what happens after that point. In the 2000s and then the 2010s, that relationship, first it flattens out in the 2000s, and then it somewhat inverts in the 2010s, so that the lowest gap in 2018, which is the last year for which we have educational attainment data available. It takes a couple years to get and to count people. The best result is for people who have less than a high school diploma. Now, it's improved for everybody, but the best result is that red dot. The worst result is for those with some college, associate's degree, or bachelor's degree, or higher. They have the biggest gap. So something has changed in terms of what education does. It no longer creates a benefit for the relative status of men and women. Simply moving to a better education level, it may increase your pay, but it also may increase the inequality in pay between a woman who gets that higher education and a man who gets that higher education. Let's think about what education leads to, right? Education leads to different results depending on the kind of education you get that qualifies you for different kinds of jobs, or the lack of education you have that leads to certain other jobs being possible. And those jobs are more pay or less pay. So let's compare 2009 and 2019. Men and women in the workforce, right? Men and women are in the workforce, but one of the things we know is that women still are not in the workforce quite as often as men are. Although this has increased quite a lot in recent decades, it's kind of stagnated in the last decade or so. So that in 2009, overall, if you look down at the bottom number here under women 2009, 47.3% of the workforce was women. But it dropped by 0.03%, basically the same level in 2019. Stalled progress. If our idea of progress is that men and women are in the workforce in this to the same degree, earning resources. Resources equals power. But there's something else that we can do within either 2009 or 2019. We can look at that overall average, right? A percentage is an average. Overall, women make up 47.3% of the general workforce, everybody who's working. But that percentage changes by certain kinds of jobs. So sometimes it goes below 47.3%. What are those jobs? We'll take a look at the first two. Physicians and lawyers, 32.2% and 32.4%, respectively, are women in 2009, according to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, working with the current population survey. So men are disproportionately in those jobs, women are disproportionately not in those jobs, and physicians and lawyers earn a fair amount of change, right? They have high incomes. Who has less income than a physician? A nurse. Now, nurses still, they earn a pretty good income, but in the healthcare field, they get paid less than doctors do. Oh, and look, 92% of nurses in 2009 are women. Cashiers, receptionists, secretaries. Among those working in these the service environment, cashiers and receptionists, or in the professional world, receptionists and secretaries, they're strongly women, and they end up getting less pay than some other jobs might get, such as executives, right, or CEOs in particular. And those are the jobs that are filled disproportionately, very strongly disproportionately with women. So if we think about the sex gap in pay, all of these people in these different jobs can all be working full time. But if men are disproportionately lawyers and physicians and women are proportionally cashiers, receptionists, secretaries, and nurses who get paid less even in the same fields, that's going to lead to a gap. That's going to lead to a difference in result. The final thing we can do with this slide is compare from 2009 to 2019. And we can see the percentage of women in those fields has gone up. Among physicians, if the target for equity, right, equal percentages of women and men in the workforce and in the particular job of physicians, right, then 47.0% would be the target for equity in numbers. And boy, they moved up from 32.2% women in 2009 to 40.8% in 2019. That's a big shift for 10 years. Also lawyers. Now they went up a little less, they went up 4%, but that's also a significant movement. So that you have individuals who are now physicians and lawyers more often are women, not as often as chance alone would suggest, which is that what 47.0% would indicate about those who are in the workforce. But it's moving in that direction. And the share of cashiers, receptionists, registered nurses, and secretaries who are women is going down. So there are proportionally more men entering those lower paid fields. And it's disproportionately still dominated by women, but to a slightly less extent. Lower extent, it's ticking down. That indicates that occupational movement of different people into different places, which has a name, it's called segregation, occupational gender segregation, among these jobs is still there in 2019, but it is on the decline. It is waning. So systems of stratification can change while the order remains the same. If you think about education as providing a very important key to be able to unlock the door to becoming something like a lawyer or a physician, a high-paid position, then a question is, well, who gets access to that? At the lowest level, the question is, do you drop out from high school? Because if you drop out from high school, it's very hard to get a job that is, especially at the entry level, that does not pay minimum wage. The jobs for people without high school diplomas tend to be lower, especially if you don't get any additional training. There's been a change that's occurred, and it occurred quite a long time ago, and it has remained since. If you look at the this graph and you look at the year 1976 about, before 1976, if women are green, men are in orange here, the dropout rate was higher for women than it was for men. Women tended to work less in the workforce. They still engaged in labor, but it was unpaid domestic labor inside the home, and one which was dependent on income of a man with whom they were in a relationship. That led to a higher dropout rate for women, and men were more likely to stay in school. What's interesting is that since then, men have started to have a higher dropout rate than women. Women are continuing on at least to get their high school diploma. What about higher levels of education, which would lead people to be able to get access to professional jobs for which a college degree seems to be mandatory these days? Well, the National Center for Education Statistics takes a few years to get its data together. So the last year that we have data for right now is 2016, but we can show a long period of time from 1966 to 2016, 50 years of movement. If women are blue here, men are orange. And we're talking about the number of degrees conferred for associate's degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, and doctoral level degrees, MDs, JDs, PhDs, and the like. EdDs. They all have a D in it. They're all doctoral degrees. You see some commonality and some difference. First of all, what you see is from the period of, starting in 1966, who's earning more of those degrees at any level is the orange line. They are higher, it's men. And also, if you look at 2016, the most recent year for which data is available, who's earning more degrees? Women in each of these levels, at each of these levels. Okay, but if we look at the difference, in 1966, the difference was lowest, that is, women were closest to where men were, for the lowest educational position that would end up leading to compensate you with a lower paying job. The gap gets a little wider in 66 for bachelor's degrees, still wider for master's degrees, and in 1966, a huge gap for doctoral degrees, which end up getting people jobs that tend to pay the most. Doctors, lawyers, professionals of all sorts, engineers, architects. Having an advanced degree is a key to really doing well in those jobs. And in 2016, on the other hand, right, it's reversed. Women are doing better, right, than men in all ways. But the gap is smallest. The advantage for women is smallest with doctoral degrees. It's a little bit bigger for bachelor's and master's degrees. And it's really big for associate's degrees. Finally, notice when the switch happens. It happens first around 1978 for associate's degrees. Then the next level, bump up level in bachelor's degrees. The switch happens in the early 80s. There's this period in which they're basically touching. In master's degrees, the early to mid 80s. And with PhDs, well, it doesn't happen until the 21st century. Okay, and so what you have is a dominance of women in associate's degrees over a long period now, from the 1970s on. Numerical dominance in bachelor's and master's degrees of women since the late 80s, okay? A dominance among women numerically that is hardly there, but it is there. But it's really only 2006, 2007, 2008. And it's really only starting to open up in the last few years. For doctoral degrees, you have this long period of time among people who are still working now, who got their degrees in the 60s, 70s, 80s, and 90s, and early 2000s, in which the majority of those high-paying jobs were men. high-paying degrees were going to men, leading them to those jobs in which those folks are now senior. In the years where women are majorities, those are people who are early in their careers, where they're going to be paid less. What will be interesting is to see what happens in the 30 years that follow. If women continue to make advances in their share of the degrees conferred, and it persists long enough for there to be this majority of women going into jobs that are associated with these kinds of higher education degrees, will that lead to an inversion of the gender pay gap? It will be interesting to see. One of the answers to that question is going to depend on what kind of advanced degrees people get. Let's look, continuing to look in the National Center for Educational Statistics, at different kinds of majors and the percent of women who are earning the bachelor's degrees. Now, 50% and above means that it's a majority women who are earning those degrees. Below 50% means it's a minority women, or we could say, therefore, majority men. If we are working with the gender binary, which the National Center for Educational Statistics does. And so we're going to have to go with that, with these statistics. So if you look at the men-dominated occupations, economics, history, theology, religion, natural sciences, mathematics, construction, engineering, architecture, there are a lot of high-paying jobs there. On the other hand, library majors, social works majors, elementary education, early education, secondary education, English. These are majors that lead to relatively low-paying jobs. There is a joke, and it's unfair because English majors are needed to make the world go around, but that when you graduate with an English major, the sentence that you need to really practice is, would you like fries with that? It's harder to get a good paying job when you come out of college with an English degree than if you have an engineering degree. Engineering bachelor's degree recipients are swept up. Mathematics majors, swept up for high paying jobs. So there's a difference in where women and men go in terms of earning their majors. And the higher paid majors, they tend to be the majors where men are. The lower paid majors tend to be the places where women are. That kind of steering, that kind of segregation, whether it occurs by choice or by constraint, by culture or by mandate, is something that's going to contribute also to the pay gap. And when we think about going above the level of bachelor's degrees to graduate school, what do you go to graduate school for? This is the percentage of doctoral degrees awarded to women by discipline. So we know that in general, by 2016, the last year for which data is available, that overall women are a majority. But there are still some fields in which they're a distinct minority. If you look at CIS, computer information systems, scarcely more than 20%. Same for engineering, same for math. Philosophy and religion is interesting there. There's a certain amount of discrimination in terms of who can take a job in some churches, right? Men only for theologically inclined jobs. So that's an interesting one. Business, architecture, right? Those are low, lower than 50%. Which are the ones that are higher than 50% women? Communication, education, English, foreign language, humanities, psychology. Those are for relatively low-paying jobs. Eventually, you can get fairly good pay as a psychologist, but it takes a lot longer than it does for an engineer or a computer scientist. So at the PhD level as well, there is sorting that is going on. where women are in certain programs, men are in certain programs, and the degrees they get as a result are associated with different levels of pay, higher levels of pay for the male-dominated degrees, which would also influence the gender pay gap. And finally, we can notice here that although there is some movement, say, for agriculture and a little bit of movement for communication, overall, those lines are pretty similar in two sets of results 5 years apart, from 2011 12 to 2016 17. The rankings are pretty much the same. And in some cases, the fields that are dominated by women most strongly, communication, education, humanities, psychology, there's a little tick up, so there are even more women. It's even more concentrated women than it used to be. So, what have we learned? We've learned that some of the sex gap in pay, the gender gap in pay, is attributable to differences in educational major or choice of field or occupation. So those differences may be due to choices people make, although those choices are in turn due to the cultural nature of gender. It's gendered expectations. What kind of job are women supposed to go into? What kind of jobs are men supposed to go into? What do we say about a woman who goes into computer science or astronomy? What do we say about a man who goes into preschool teaching or nursing? Those are negative judgments that are typically made. It's beginning to change, but it's not changing very quickly. And that cultural power, the cultural expectations we place on people has an effect on where people end up. The stories that they are told become the stories they tell themselves, and the paths in life that they weave for themselves. But what about the same occupation? What about if a man and a woman are working in the same occupation? Are they getting the same pay if they're working the same job? That is what a lot of people want to, at the end of the day, know. And so Trond Peterson and Laurie Morgan do this work, published in 1995 in the American Journal of Sociology, in which they look over a number of years, from 1974 to 1983, in the US. They look at different kinds of industries, like banking or textiles, and then they look at particular occupations within those industries. So you can be a bank teller versus a bank manager. And then they look at different establishments, different employers, like you could work for Bank of America or you could work for Bangor Savings Bank. Are there differences in different establishments? Sure, they can pay different levels of wages. Some employers are known for giving a better wage than others. Different occupations have different wages too. A bank teller doesn't earn as much as a bank manager. And both earn more than the custodian who works sweeping the floor of the bank at night. So what they do, Trond Peterson and Laurie Morgan, is to take a look first at the general gap within the industry. Then they look at the gap within the occupation. And then they look at the gap, we'll see that in a slide coming up, within the same occupation and the same establishment, so that you're working the same occupation in the same place. So we'll start out by noting the orange lines here, which is the general pay gap within all these industries. Men's and boys' shirts, yeah, it's an industry. Hospitals, banking, life insurance, textiles, etc., all the way down to steel. And what we'll see there is that although there is variation, there's an especially large gap, gender pay gap for life insurance. Women's pay as a percentage of men's pay. And there's a somewhat smaller gap for the wood furniture industry, and actually the one gap that goes over 100%, where women seem to be earning more than men do in this survey, which is hospitals. There is generally a number below 100%, which means that in general, in all but hospitals, women earn less than men do. But when you say, okay, but now let's look at the same people in the same occupations in these industries. Within the same occupations, the number moves a lot closer to 100%. From somewhere down in the 60 to low 80 range, it moves almost universally above 80%, often above 90%, and in a few cases, like 95, 96, 97, 98%, which is a huge shrinking of the gender pay gap, which indicates that most of what's going on with the gender gap in pay is that men and women in these industries are working in different jobs. Not that they're working at the same jobs. Now, this doesn't get us to 100%, but what really almost gets us to 100% is when we say, okay, now the blue line is it's the pay gap within the same occupation in the same establishment, meaning the same employer. Like McDonald's versus Burger King versus Dunkin' Donuts, okay, within fast food, or banking within the same bank, or hospitals, the same hospital system. Once you say, let's limit it to people who are in the same occupation and the same establishment, every single one of those gender gaps that you see here is above, women's pay is above 95%. And approaching 100%. In some cases, back in hospitals, it's a little over the line. In hotels and motels, it's almost there. In machinery, it's almost there. What does that indicate? That it indicates that most of the gap between what women earn and what men earn is not from two people working the same job in the same company who are getting paid different amounts. There's a little tiny gap there still, and that gap is real, but it is much smaller than the huge chasm which is occurring because men and women work in different occupations and different establishments within an industry. The vast majority of the gender gap is due to those differences in occupations and establishments within which men and women work, and the differences in pay for those occupations and establishments. The fact that the work that we send women to do, or women choose to do, is less compensated, less valued by our society. And the work that men either choose to do or are sent to do is more highly valued in society, is the source of most of the gap in pay, not explicit discrimination within the same position. And that explicit discrimination within the same position is a story that we focus on a lot. We think about remedying it a lot, but it is not most of the gender gap in pay. Most of the gender gap in pay is sorting of people. The other word for that is segregation of people by gender. Gender segregation drives the gender pay gap. So, we seem to have some kind of a conflict here. On the one hand, audit studies, also known as field experiments, seem to be showing a clear trend toward gender discrimination. And while there are some unique circumstances in which women are favored for an outcome more than men, in general, women tend to receive a poorer outcome, be ranked lower on that stratification scale. That indicates discrimination. On the other hand, we have the work of Tron Peterson in the United States, and that is an examination of the gender pay gap. And when we look at the gender pay gap, what we don't see is for a particular position within a particular occupation in a particular establishment, we don't see very much discrimination for wages there to explain the gender pay gap. Instead, what we see are people being placed in different kinds of occupations, different kinds of establishments, and that leading to the gender pay gap. So, how do we resolve this conflict? We resolve it by thinking of a system of stratification in which the end result is a layered outcome. Even when individual level cognition is not involved in active discriminating. on a person-to-person basis within the same position. Instead, it's about a system that tracks certain kinds of people into certain kinds of positions and other kinds of people into other positions, and the difference in those positions leading to a difference in outcome. The outcome is still stratification, and stratification in gender does not require always intention. Or if intention is involved to any extent, which is always hard to observe, it's at the level of steering people into certain places. So the audit studies indicate that two people who are equally qualified will end up in different places for whatever reason, according to their gender. And after they end up in those positions, they receive prestige, honor, compensation, potential for advancement that is due to that position. So while we may tend to popularly think of gender discrimination as the result of two people working the same job in the same position, and one of them being a man, one being a woman, and receiving different treatment, it's really more that those two people never ended up or never tended to end up in the same position to begin with.